UDL in Action podcast wishes to acknowledge First Nations peoples in Australia and across the world whose songlines traverse the globe. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging whose cultural traditions inspire and continue to educate.
Thanks for listening to UDL in Action, the podcast that takes global UDL thinking and gives it a local Aussie flavour. In this episode, we start with a question many early career teachers ask. How do you support students' emotions and reactions during learning? We are going to explore practical ways to design classroom environments that help students build emotional awareness using a universal design for learning approach. I'm your host, Rebecca Rosenberg. I am joined by my talented co-host, Rhonda Laswell from Indiana. Who better to help us unpack Guideline 9? Rhonda is a retired educator and Universal Design for Learning coordinator. She spent nearly 2 decades immersed in UDL as both a teacher and a professional development coach for educators. We are so grateful to have Rhonda share her decades of experience with us in each episode. Rhonda, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So to get us underway, we have Zach joining us. Zach is an early career teacher who is currently working in a regional high school in Queensland. Zach is keen to learn more about UDL, and we are keen for all educators to understand UDL and how to utilise it. Zach's question for this episode is:
I'm noticing that some students struggle to manage frustration, reflect on mistakes, or even work through emotions during learning. As a new teacher, how can I support students' emotional development without it feeling like an extra thing to teach?
So, Rhonda, student motivation or lack thereof and emotional dysregulation is difficult to deal with as an experienced teacher. So, for our early career teachers, how can they support students' emotional growth without it feeling like one more thing on their plate, while honouring the fact that every learner is different? I'm keen to hear your advice to teachers on how they can design environments that support their students' emotional development.
So we're speaking specifically to Zach's question around high school, and there are things that can certainly be done at the elementary and the middle school level, but I want to answer his question directly first. And that is, teenagers in general, right? They come into class with a lot of stuff. Whether it's from the lockers, the hallway, lunch, whatever it is, the night before, the morning of. And they're carrying things that we just, we may not have ever experienced. And so I think it's a really great practice to start class by just acknowledging, right? We all come from different places. And just if you take 1 minute of quiet, eyes closed, calm, teacher walking you through relaxation, it's amazing the power that has. And the reason that's so powerful is that it helps to regulate the student in the space that they're in at the moment. But believe it or not, over time, if you do that regularly, it's 1 minute, right? 1 minute out of your day. And if you think about putting a minute in versus retroactively having to come back and dealing with a behavior that lasts much longer than that, it's just a good way to get students in the mindset of really taking some time to center themselves. And I actually had a teacher at one of the high schools, and I loved going to his classroom because I knew I got that moment right at the beginning of his class to do that really centralized calming activity. And students learn that, wow, I can do this anytime. Like, I don't have to do this just like right before science. And so I think speaking to the secondary people, there's nothing wrong with that. Teaching students how to center and regulate is really important.
It's so
And
proactive.
Oh, it's completely proactive, and it's what the
Mm.
body and the brain needs. And we don't
Mm.
slow down enough, and we don't acknowledge that enough. And then if you back down into some of the other grade levels, the younger grade levels, I think just teaching students how to identify their emotions, but also to validate them. I think we often try to just move on. And what we really need to say is, oh, I see you're frustrated. What are you frustrated about? And asking those questions. But I also think it's really important, especially if we do this at the younger grade levels than at the older. It gets easier, right? Because we've taught them. And if we do that as a building or as a school district, then what we're really doing is we're teaching people, people, right? How to be aware, acknowledge, state, and then be able to process that appropriately instead of just saying, oh, well, you should know how to behave. You should know how to sit still. You should know how to deal with that frustration. And what we really need to be teaching our students is how to identify those emotions and then how to move forward from that. And something as simple as um, just putting up some emojis, right? A great activity you can do that doesn't take a lot of time is I've done this with teachers. You just print off little emoji cards with all different emojis and you just throw them out there on the table and you say, okay, how do you feel about this professional development we're getting ready to do? And have them pick their emoji, right? How do you feel about math? Pick your emoji. How do you feel about taking a test? Pick your emoji. And you're just beginning that process of teaching them how to identify the emotion. And then from there, you can come up with ways to support a healthy response to those things. But you cannot help a student with their emotional capacity if you don't first teach them how to identify what those emotions are and validate them.
It's also teaching our students the importance of acknowledging that emotion and enabling and allowing yourself to realign before the next task that is before you. Because we can so readily just put one thing on top of the other. It's just what we do, as opposed to just taking things one step, one goal at a time. That's wonderful advice.
Right. It's really no different than us moving on from a skill to another skill and like, oh,
Yeah.
well, you'll get it, right? Most of the kids have it, 80% have it. Let's just move on to the next one. And what we do when we do that is we actually end up invalidating where they're at, not just emotionally, right? But where they're at from an academic perspective. And so you cannot do one without the other. If you do, you're going to see behaviors that you don't want to see.
That's such wonderful advice in response to Zach's question. So moving on from there, what's your thoughts around advice to teachers and on how they can design environments that can support their students' emotional development before students come into the classroom? I love the emoji idea though.
Absolutely. So when we think about before students even enter the room, we know we're going to have kiddos who are going to struggle with that, right? And they're not going to have come into the room being able to identify those things. And so making a space that can be utilized for any student at any time is really important. So you can call it whatever you want. I like to call them amygdala first aid stations, right? Because the amygdala is the emotional portion of the brain, but you can just call it a calm down station. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but putting things in that space that students can utilize to help recenter themselves, to ground themselves. It can be anything from um, things that are tactile, it can be coloring, it could be a weighted stuffy or a weighted blanket, just something that for them really allows them to be grounded. Sometimes watching sand fall through a timer is mesmerizing and helps ground them. The other thing that's really important is that you teach students So when they come in, you say, okay, sometimes we have a bad day. Have you ever had a bad day? Yeah. Have you ever just had a moment where you just felt like you weren't into what we were doing and you needed to calm yourself down? You teach them how to use the station. You also have a timer, right? So they get so many minutes to utilize that station. And that teaches them that I need to reset and then come back. I need to reset and come back. And I've had teachers who have had students who have had to actually do personal check-ins, and they've had to go up to the teacher and say, fourth grade, and say, this is overwhelming me. And, the teacher would set a timer and say, okay, I want you to go sit in the quiet space for 2 minutes and then come back and try two more questions. And what we're
Mm,
doing there is we're building their stamina and we're
mm.
building their capacity to be able to spend that time that is a load on them for learning because they've got so many other things going on that there's really nothing left over in the brain for that learning space. And so, you're honoring that. And will most kids ever use it? No. 80% probably won't ever utilize that. But for the 20 or the 15%, it's a game changer. It might be the moment that they actually engage in learning and they decide that education is important.
That's great. So the station is like a safe space for
Mhm.
students to use if they feel they need to. But again, there's choice in whether or not that space is used. If the space is used, you are encouraging timers so students to be aware that this is for a period, but then the expectation is to return to what's happening in the class. But this is a kind approach. It's not a timetabled agenda, which
Mhm.
is what we also very much want to apply to and follow, but sometimes you just need a breather from the routine that keeps coming. I really love the gentle approach that you have given us. So that's great.
And you have to teach it, right? You have to
Mm,
teach students how to utilize it, and that's okay. I mean,
yeah.
if students haven't had the opportunity to learn how to calm themselves down, then this really becomes a very profound experience for them. And I've seen it work beautifully for so many kiddos.
For little people right through to our older students, our
Absolutely.
Year 12 students.
So
That's
let's
great.
think about that for a minute. In a high school environment,
Mm.
one of the things that you may have that's very beneficial for high school kids is it may not necessarily be a calm down station, but it might be a cabinet where there's snacks available, where there's some water available, where there's some basic things that I need to help me. And so a lot of times it's just very often I didn't get breakfast, I didn't have breakfast, I didn't have what I needed, and go over and grab a snack, and that just helps me to regulate. So absolutely.
Or even just, I forgot my pencil case. It's just another thing I need to deal with. I
Yeah.
need to go and grab a pen.
You
There's
know
the
what?
cupboard. I know I'm freely able to grab a pen.
Give the kid a pencil. You don't need to discipline a kid for not having a pencil. You need to give a kid a pencil. It's that
It's
simple.
it's so simple, so simple. So thinking about Guideline 9 of UDL, it emphasizes helping students manage their own learning and stay motivated, and that's what we've been talking about. So, from your perspective, what are the key considerations educators need to keep in mind to support self regulation and engagement for students with diverse needs?
Well, I think first of all, it's just teaching students that it's okay to have emotions, validating those emotions, and then teaching them healthy ways to deal with them, which is a social skill. But at the end of the day, then you can take that and you can move that into some other spaces that work well anywhere in the world, right? So think about restorative practices, creative problem solving. When you bring students into the conversation versus that very punitive kicking a kid out, there's a reentry that has to happen. And a lot of times it's not uncommon for nothing to be said. The kid just shows back up the next day, right? And so with restorative practices and creative problem solving, you're creating a culture of learning, but you're also creating a culture of mutual acceptance and respect. And so having those conversations is really important. And kids are much better at that than we often give them credit for. They're better at it oftentimes than adults are. And I've even seen them be better at the forgiveness piece and the acceptance piece than some adults can be as well. So giving them that platform to be able to say, hey, what needs to be done to fix this? Right? What happened? What do we need to do to make this better? They have great ideas. So instead of us just having all this stuff that we say they should and shouldn't do, it's really about bringing them into the conversation and making them part of the process. And I think for anything related to Guideline 9 and emotional capacity, it's a process. It's a process of community. And if you put that work in up front, say at the beginning of the school year, um, it will take care of itself. Students will say, hey, we need to have a class meeting. We need to talk about this. So-and-so just did this and we need to have a conversation. Like they will advocate and they will take it and they will utilize it in a way that's appropriate and that's healthy, that's beneficial, and that really minimizes, brings behaviors down, and really allows the community to be a place that is safe. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. You can't learn if you don't feel safe. The
It
brain
sure is.
cannot learn if it feels unsafe or accosted.
What about, Rhonda, when you have students that are just refusing to do a task and not necessarily opening up why they don't want to partake in the activity that you've spent hours planning for, and you've provided options, so you've made the physical environment as accessible as you feel is appropriate, and the social emotional environment, you've implemented all the things that you've been listening to our podcast and intentionally implemented those supports. But you've got that one or two students who are just, they do not want to have anything to do with what you've got in front of them, and they're shutting down. What would you suggest? What would be one key consideration or takeaway that you would encourage our early career teachers to consider when encountering students such as these?
Absolutely. So there's a lot going on there from an emotional perspective oftentimes, and it may not have anything to do with the instruction, or it actually may be an instructional issue where they feel very embarrassed, they don't feel capable. Either way, the best thing you can do in that situation is to become parallel and present. And what I mean by that is you literally need to bend down. You need to squat down next to them. You need to be shoulder to shoulder. You need to be parallel. And then you need to be present in that moment. And you need to be soft. Emotional contagion is a real thing. If you're frustrated, feel it, right? I mean, if you're annoyed, they know it. And the thing to remember with kiddos in that space is that if they are hijacked, they're spending their time panning and scanning for threat. And if you're towering over them, if you're changing your tone or your voice, they see that as a threat. So becoming very soft, becoming parallel and becoming present, and then just asking, hey, what's going on? What are you struggling with about this? What is it you don't like about this? Ask. There's a concept, ask them. And I will tell you, the most honest students in your room are often the ones that you struggle with the most. They will just tell you if you give them the courtesy of the parallel and the present. The other thing you have to remember is for a student who's hijacked, they don't have a lot of brain left over. Like they are spending so much time and attention on the threat perspective and on survival, that for them, executive functioning is like a luxury. And so that's why it's so important that you make yourself and the environment as soft for them as possible. And again, like I said, it's just being parallel, it's being present, it's asking, and it's being honest. Sometimes it's giving up some power. As educators, we control often a lot of the power in the room. Sharing power is the most difficult thing we can do. And so saying, what is it you need? What would be helpful? Giving up that power to maybe them moving in a different location, them sitting on the floor. I don't know what their need is. I know with my own students, that was some of the things that came up. But sharing that power helps them with that locus of control, because outside of the classroom, they may have no control. Their life may be in such chaos that they have no control. And by you just giving them a small amount of control in the room, that may open that amygdala and open that executive function and open that brain up enough that they can become calm enough during that time to actually be able to engage in learning.
That is insightful and wise advice. I will most certainly be taking that on myself in my workplace.
We as
UDL,
people need to acknowledge that, right?
we sure do. We sure do. And UDL isn't about doing more. It's about designing smarter with an intention and empathy, which is exactly what you've been talking about, Rhonda. You don't need to be an expert in UDL to begin applying it. If you're thinking about barriers, providing options, and designing with learners in mind, you're already moving in the right direction. Rhonda, thank you once again for your wisdom and sharing your knowledge on how to put UDL into practice. Before we wrap up, what's one takeaway you'd like our listeners to walk away with?
Oh, being biologically respectful is powerful. And when we meet a student where they're at from an emotional perspective, we are trained to meet students where they're at from an intellectual or academic perspective. But when we're biologically respectful and we meet them where they're at on an emotional level, that's the only way we can get to the intellectual and the academic. So just always remember that, kindness counts, and that being biologically respectful doesn't mean just intellectually, it's socially, it's emotionally, and it's instructionally.
Being biologically respectful
Of their brain.
of their brain and being kind. So much in
Yes.
that. Thank you for tuning in. If today's episode sparked ideas or reflections, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at udl.in.action.podcast@gmail.com. And if you'd like the show notes or resources mentioned, just click on the link at the end of each episode description to our G Drive folder for listeners. And please share our podcast with your colleagues through YouTube or Spotify. Until next time, keep designing for possibility and not predictability. Bye for now.
Toodaloo.